In a world where desperation can lead to unexpected choices, Rachel Moore, a single mother struggling to provide for her young son, finds herself at the crossroads of an unimaginable decision. With mounting debts, an eviction notice looming, and the weight of responsibility on her shoulders, Rachel feels as though she has run out of options. When a seemingly improbable opportunity presents itself, an elite auction where wealthy men bid for companionship, Rachel's overwhelming need to secure a future for her son pushes her into uncharted territory. What follows is a journey that will test her courage, strength, and the very essence of her character. As Rachel steps into a world of luxury and wealth, she unknowingly begins a transformation, not only in her life but in the life of the man who buys her, Ethan Carter. Through moments of hardship and unexpected connection, Rachel must navigate the complex boundaries of love, trust, and sacrifice, all while holding on to the hope of providing a better future for her son. Rachel's struggles and desperation. Rachel Moore leaned against the cold, peeling wall of her tiny, cramped apartment, her eyes fixed on the stack of overdue bills that seemed to taunt her. Each envelope represented a looming deadline, a reminder of her failure to provide for her son, Liam. The landlord's eviction notice was pinned to the refrigerator, a harsh symbol of the precariousness of their lives. As she looked at the notice, the weight of responsibility settled heavily on her chest. Rachel had always been determined to do everything she could for Liam, but despite working long hours as a waitress at a small, run-down diner, it never seemed to be enough. Liam, her 5-year-old son, was sprawled on the floor in the corner of their living room, his tiny hands gripping a worn-out toy truck. His innocent giggles filled the room, a sound that was both heartwarming and heartbreaking. To Liam, life was simple. He had no understanding of the financial struggles his mother faced. He didn't know that the bills were piling up, that the rent was overdue, or that Rachel was working double shifts just to put food on the table. His world was still full of laughter, imagination, and the joy of playing with his old toys. But for Rachel, every giggle from her son felt like a reminder of how much she had failed to shield him from the harsh realities of life. Her efforts to provide for Liam seemed fruitless. The tips she earned at the diner were never enough to cover the rent, let alone the growing costs of daycare for Liam while she worked. The cycle of working and barely making ends meet had worn her down to the point of exhaustion, and the pressure of it all was starting to break her. No matter how hard she tried, it felt like the walls were closing in on her. There was no way out, no easy solution, and the constant worry about Liam's future gnawed at her every day. That night, after Liam had finally fallen asleep, Rachel found herself staring at her phone in a moment of silence. The small apartment was dark except for the dim light from the screen. As she scrolled through social media in a haze of frustration, a bold ad caught her eye. The words, "Change your life forever," were emblazoned across the screen, followed by the promise of exclusive opportunity, financial freedom. Rachel's heart skipped a beat. The details of the ad seemed far-fetched, an elite auction where wealthy men bid for companionship, where a woman's beauty and presence could change her life overnight. Rachel immediately felt a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. This wasn't her world. She wasn't the type of person who would ever consider something like this. But the weight of her situation, the fear of losing everything, and the desire to give Liam a better life pushed her to keep reading. Her mind raced. She thought of her son's innocent face, his laughter, and how deeply she loved him. How could she possibly protect him if they ended up on the streets? What choice did she have? She had nothing left to lose. With trembling fingers, Rachel clicked on the link to learn more. The auction was being held at a luxurious hotel in downtown Chicago, a far cry from the tiny apartment she called home. The thought of stepping into such an unfamiliar world filled her with dread, but desperation was a powerful motivator. She needed a way out. She needed to save Liam. As the hours passed, Rachel's mind was consumed by the ad. She lay in bed next to Liam, listening to his steady breathing, wondering if she could go through with it. The idea felt like a betrayal, of herself, of her values, of everything she believed in. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that this could be her only chance to give her son a future. A chance to escape the constant struggle, to stop worrying about paying bills and keeping a roof over their heads. It was a choice she never thought she would have to make, but as she lay there, she realized she was already deep in the grip of a desperate hope, hoping that this strange opportunity might be the key to everything she had ever dreamed of for Liam. Rachel's decision and arrival at the auction. The following evening, Rachel stood in front of her worn-out dresser, staring at the only decent dress she owned. It was a thrift store find, simple, practical, and far from the glamorous attire she imagined would be expected at an elite auction. She ran a hand through her tangled hair, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She had never been the type of woman to gamble with her dignity, but something about the opportunity pulled her in. She had made up her mind. She was going. She had to. The thought of Liam's future was the only thing that mattered now. As Rachel stepped out of her apartment and into the cold night, she felt the sharp contrast between her life and the world she was about to enter. The limousine that had arrived to pick her up was sleek and black, its tinted windows a reflection of the vast distance between the world she knew and the one she was about to enter. The driver opened the door for her, and she stepped inside, feeling like an imposter. Her heart pounded in her chest, and a wave of nausea rolled through her. She tried to steady her breathing, but the anxiety was overwhelming. The drive to downtown Chicago felt surreal, like a dream that she couldn't quite wake up from. The flashing lights of the city passed by, and for the first time, Rachel felt small. She had always prided herself on her independence, on doing whatever it took to survive for Liam. But now, as she drove through the city streets, she couldn't help but feel insignificant. The life she had built, the life she was fighting to keep, seemed so far removed from the world she was heading into. When the limousine finally pulled up to the luxurious hotel, Rachel's stomach dropped. The towering building gleamed under the city lights, its polished glass windows reflecting the world outside, a world she didn't belong to. A man in a sharply tailored suit greeted her at the entrance. His smile was polite but didn't reach his eyes. "Ms. Moore, please follow me," he said curtly, handing her a badge that read, "Lot 27. The words made Rachel's stomach churn. Lot 27. She wasn't a person, she was an object to be bought and sold. As they walked through the grand foyer of the hotel, Rachel couldn't help but feel out of place. The marble floors were pristine, and the chandeliers overhead sparkled with an artificial beauty that seemed cold and unwelcoming. The guests around her were dressed in luxurious gowns and sharp suits, their laughter and conversations echoing off the high ceilings. She felt like a fish out of water. The dress she wore, though simple, was all she could afford, and she knew it couldn't compete with the extravagance surrounding her. When they entered the main hall, Rachel's anxiety skyrocketed. The atmosphere was electric, charged with anticipation. Wealthy men sat in rows of plush chairs, their eyes scanning the women as they entered the stage. The looks they gave her made Rachel's skin crawl. They weren't looking at her as a person. They were appraising her, sizing her up as if she were some kind of commodity. Rachel's heart raced as she realized the full weight of what she was about to do. This wasn't a room of people, it was a room of buyers and sellers, and she was the product on display. The auctioneer's voice boomed through the room, announcing the women one by one. When Rachel's name was called, her legs felt like lead. She could barely move, but somehow she forced herself to take the first step toward the stage. The spotlight hit her like a wave of heat, blinding her and making her feel even more exposed. Every step felt like an eternity, and she could feel the eyes of the entire room on her. She forced herself to breathe, thinking of Liam, of the promise she had made to herself to get him out of this mess. He was worth the humiliation, worth the sacrifice. When she reached the center of the stage, the auctioneer's voice cut through the silence. Lot 27, a stunning example of grace and strength. Bidding starts at $500. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest. The words felt like a slap. This wasn't about her strength, her courage, or her love for her son. This was about the money, the transaction. She tried to hold her head high, but as murmurs rippled through the crowd, Rachel's confidence faltered. She felt like an object on display, her worth being measured by the bids that followed. Then, a commanding voice broke through the murmurings, and the room fell silent. $1 million, the voice declared. Rachel's head snapped to the back of the room where a tall man stood, partially shrouded in shadow. His suit was impeccably tailored, his dark hair perfectly styled. His expression was unreadable, and there was a quiet confidence in his posture. All eyes turned to him as the auctioneer's voice rang out, "Sold for $1 million to Ethan Carter." The words echoed in Rachel's mind, and for a moment, everything around her seemed to blur. She felt dizzy, overwhelmed by what had just happened. She wasn't sure if she had made the right choice, if she had just sealed her fate. But as she stepped off the stage, Ethan Carter approached her, his stride measured and purposeful. His eyes locked onto hers, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk," he said in a low, steady voice. Rachel's new life at Ethan's estate. The next morning, as Rachel stood in the grand foyer of Ethan Carter's estate, she couldn't help but feel like she had stepped into a different world, one that was as foreign to her as the moon. The sleek black limousine that had driven her from her small apartment now felt like a distant memory, replaced by the imposing gates and perfectly manicured lawns that stretched as far as the eye could see. This was no longer Chicago. This was a place where money, power, and influence reigned supreme. Everything about it screamed wealth and privilege, and Rachel felt herself shrinking in comparison. When the car pulled up to the front of the mansion, Ethan was already waiting at the entrance, his face unreadable as usual. He greeted her with a nod, his cold gaze sweeping over her for a moment before he motioned for her to follow him inside. Rachel hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to expect next. She had signed the contract. She had committed to staying here for 1 year in exchange for a chance to escape her financial nightmare. But the reality of it all was sinking in. The house was massive, far beyond anything she had ever imagined. The marble floors gleamed under the soft light, and the crystal chandeliers above added to the grandeur of the space. Yet, despite the opulence, the atmosphere felt oddly cold. It was as if the walls themselves were too perfect, too pristine, to be inviting. Ethan led her through the house with his usual air of detachment. He showed her to a guest room that was both lavish and intimidating. The bed was large, covered in expensive silk sheets that felt foreign to Rachel's touch. She sat on the edge of the bed, trying to process the overwhelming shift in her reality. Her life had been simple, albeit difficult, but this was something else entirely. Everything here was designed to make her feel small, insignificant, and out of place. And yet, she couldn't deny the beauty of the surroundings. She had never experienced anything like it in her life. It was a reminder of the life she could never have, until now. As she wandered around the room, taking in the gilded decor and fine furnishings, Rachel's mind raced. She thought of Liam. Was he okay? Was he scared without her? Every moment apart from him felt like a betrayal, but she had promised herself she would endure this for his future. Her son deserved better than what she had been able to give him. This was the only way to secure a future where he wouldn't have to struggle the way she had. The silence in the room was deafening, and Rachel felt an overwhelming sense of isolation. Though she had made the decision to come here, a part of her still couldn't fully accept what she had done. She had sold herself, in a way, for the chance at a better life. Was it worth it? Could she really live with herself after this? She didn't have the answers, but she knew one thing for sure: she had to stay strong for Liam. She couldn't let her son down. That night, Rachel lay awake in the lavish bed, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. The luxurious surroundings didn't bring comfort. Instead, they served as a stark reminder of how far removed she was from her old life. She missed the familiar chaos of her cramped apartment, the sound of Liam's laughter, the hum of the television in the background, the simple, mundane things that made her feel human. Here, everything felt cold and empty. There were no familiar voices, no neighbors checking in on her, no sense of community. Just silence and the distant hum of Ethan's world. The next morning, Rachel was woken by a soft knock at the door. It was Helen, the housekeeper, who brought her a tray with breakfast. Helen was kind, though Rachel couldn't help but notice the formality in the woman's demeanor. She was polite, almost distant, as if she were accustomed to dealing with people like Rachel, outsiders who didn't belong in this world. "Good morning, Miss Moore," she said warmly, her smile genuine, yet laced with the same coldness that seemed to hang in the air. "Mr. Carter asked me to ensure you're comfortable. He will meet you in the study after breakfast to discuss your responsibilities." Rachel managed a weak smile, though she didn't feel much like smiling. The words, responsibilities, hit her like a weight. What would Ethan expect from her? What kind of life would she be living here? She had agreed to this arrangement, but now that she was here, the reality was settling in, and it wasn't as simple as she had imagined. She ate the breakfast in silence, the food delicious but tasteless. The food and the room, the mansion and the luxuries, it all felt like a dream. It was nothing more than a gilded cage, a place of comfort that couldn't fill the emptiness she felt inside. The only thing that truly mattered to her was Liam. She had to get back to him, but she had to endure this first. After breakfast, Rachel made her way to the study where Ethan was waiting for her. The room was everything she had expected, sophisticated and cold. Bookshelves lined the walls, and a massive mahogany desk stood in the center of the room. Ethan was standing by the window, his back to her. When he turned to face her, his piercing gaze felt like a spotlight. He gestured for her to sit, and Rachel obeyed. "I assume you've read through the contract in full," Ethan said, his voice formal and detached. Rachel nodded, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had skimmed the document the night before, but she wasn't sure she fully understood the gravity of what she had signed. Ethan continued, outlining the expectations. She would accompany him to events, maintain a presentable appearance, and adhere to a strict schedule for medical procedures. His tone was clinical, devoid of emotion. Rachel felt a lump form in her throat. It was all so cold, so transactional. But as much as she wanted to rebel, to walk away, she knew she couldn't. She had made a promise to Liam, and she had to keep it. A changing relationship between Rachel and Ethan. In the days that followed, Rachel continued to navigate her new reality at Ethan Carter's estate. The mansion, with its marble floors and opulent decor, seemed both beautiful and isolating. She had come to understand that the estate wasn't just a place of luxury. It was a symbol of Ethan's control, his need for perfection, and his distant, almost cold persona. Each day felt like she was walking on eggshells, unsure of where she stood in this new world. Ethan's presence was ever watchful, and his demeanor remained formal and businesslike, leaving Rachel to feel more like an employee than a person. At first, Rachel didn't know how to interact with Ethan. She had signed the contract with a heavy heart, knowing that she was doing this for Liam, but now that she was here, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was just a means to an end, a tool to help Ethan achieve his goals. He had made it clear from the beginning that he needed an heir, and Rachel was the one he had chosen to help him fulfill that need. Their relationship was built on a cold, transactional foundation, and it was clear to Rachel that Ethan saw her as nothing more than a business arrangement. Yet, despite the formality of their interactions, Rachel began to notice small shifts in Ethan's behavior that suggested there was more to him than the stern, calculating businessman she had first encountered. One afternoon, as she wandered through the gardens of the estate, she found Ethan sitting by a small fountain, sketching something in a notebook. The sight of him was unexpected. He was usually so reserved, so composed. But here, in the quiet solitude of the garden, he seemed different. There was a vulnerability to him, something Rachel hadn't seen before. His sharp features were softened by the warm light of the afternoon, and his posture was relaxed, as if he were lost in thought. Rachel hesitated for a moment, unsure if she should approach. But before she could turn away, Ethan spoke without looking up from his notebook. "Do you always hover when you're unsure of what to do?" His voice was low, but there was no harshness in it, only a curious tone. Rachel flushed, embarrassed to have been caught staring. "I didn't mean to disturb you," she replied, her voice soft. "You're not," he said, his tone unexpectedly kind. He set the notebook down on the ground beside him and patted the bench next to him, inviting her to sit. Rachel sat down hesitantly, unsure of what to say. The silence between them was thick, but it wasn't uncomfortable. For the first time since arriving at the estate, Rachel felt like she could relax, even if just for a moment. "These gardens were my mother's favorite place," Ethan said after a long pause, his voice quieter now. "She used to say they were the only part of this house that felt alive." Rachel was surprised by his openness. She had assumed Ethan was impervious to emotions, that he had built up walls so high that no one could ever reach him. But as he spoke of his mother, something in his demeanor shifted. He was no longer the cold, distant man who had bought her at the auction. In this moment, he seemed like a person who had lost something important and was struggling to make sense of it all. "They are beautiful," Rachel said, glancing around at the lush flowers and winding paths that seemed to stretch endlessly through the estate. "It's hard to imagine that something so peaceful could exist in a place like this." Ethan glanced at her, and for the first time, Rachel saw a faint smile tug at the corners of his lips. "Beauty can't fix everything, though, can it?" he said, his voice tinged with sadness. Rachel didn't know how to respond. She could sense that there was more to Ethan than the stoic exterior he presented to the world. Beneath the carefully constructed facade, there was a man who had suffered, who carried his own burdens, and who, in some ways, was just as lost as she felt. But before she could speak, Ethan stood up abruptly, closing his notebook with a snap. "Good night, Rachel," he said, his usual guarded demeanor returning. "I'll see you tomorrow." Rachel watched him walk away, her thoughts swirling. She had never expected to feel any connection to Ethan, but in that brief exchange, something had shifted. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but she had glimpsed something human beneath his cold, businesslike persona. And for the first time, she wondered if perhaps there was more to him than just the man who had bought her at the auction. The next few weeks brought more moments like that one. Ethan's behavior toward her was still formal, but Rachel began to see small glimpses of a softer side of him, an occasional smile, a moment of shared laughter, a look of genuine curiosity about her life. The distance between them began to shrink, not because of anything Rachel had done, but because Ethan seemed to be slowly letting down the walls he had built around himself. One evening, as Rachel sat by the window, watching the sunset over the estate, she found herself thinking about Ethan more than she ever had before. She had come to the mansion with a singular focus, to provide a better future for Liam. But now, in the midst of the isolation and the coldness of the estate, she found herself questioning her own feelings. Ethan was still the man who had bought her, the man who needed her to fulfill a specific role. But he was also someone who had been shaped by loss, by grief, and by the pressures of his family's legacy. Rachel's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on her door. It was Helen, who had become a source of comfort during her time at the estate. She smiled warmly as she entered. "How are you settling in, Miss Moore?" she asked, her voice gentle. Rachel managed a smile. "I'm doing okay," she replied. "It's just a lot to adjust to." Helen nodded in understanding. "It's a big change, I know. But remember, you're here for a reason. Don't forget that." Rachel looked at Helen, her heart heavy. She had made the decision to come here for Liam, but she couldn't help but wonder if there was more to it than just survival. As the days passed, she began to see Ethan in a new light. He wasn't just a wealthy businessman with a cold heart. He was a man who had suffered, a man who had built his empire on the pain of his past. And, somehow, she felt a connection to him that she hadn't anticipated. A new beginning for Rachel, Ethan, and Liam. As the months passed, the dynamics between Rachel and Ethan continued to evolve in ways neither of them had expected. The rigid boundaries set by their initial contract began to blur, and a deeper connection started to form between them. Rachel's role in Ethan's life had initially been defined by obligation and necessity. She was there to fulfill a contract, to provide him with an heir, to help him continue the legacy of his family. But over time, she became more than just a business arrangement. She became a partner, someone he could trust and confide in. Ethan, for his part, found himself drawn to Rachel in a way he had never anticipated. Despite his initial intentions, he couldn't ignore the depth of her strength, her unwavering love for Liam, and the way she navigated the complexities of their situation with grace. He admired her resilience, the way she had fought for everything she had in life, especially for her son. Slowly, Ethan began to open up to her in ways he had never done with anyone before. His guarded demeanor softened, and he started sharing pieces of his past. His struggles with loss, his sense of duty to his family, and the weight of responsibility that had shaped his entire life. One evening, as Rachel sat by the fire in the grand living room, Ethan approached her with an unexpected proposal. He had been distant, focused on his business, and Rachel had grown accustomed to his cold, aloof nature. But tonight was different. Ethan seemed more vulnerable, his usual businesslike tone replaced by something softer. "Rachel," he began, his voice hesitant, "when we first met, I thought this would be a simple arrangement, a transaction. But you've shown me something I never expected. Life isn't just about control or business deals. It's about connection. It's about family. I want that with you. Not because of the contract, but because I care about you, and Liam." Rachel's heart skipped a beat. She had never imagined that Ethan would say something like this. She had come to this estate with the sole purpose of securing a better future for Liam, to escape the crushing weight of her financial troubles. But as the months had passed, she had begun to realize that her feelings for Ethan had shifted. She had come to care for him, not just as the man who had bought her, but as someone who had, in his own way, offered her a new beginning. She had seen the cracks in his facade, the man beneath the wealth and the power. And, slowly, she had started to trust him, to believe that perhaps he wasn't as cold and heartless as he had once seemed. "I care about you too," Rachel whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "And I want that for Liam, for us. I never imagined this could happen, but here we are. Together." Ethan's face softened, and he reached out, taking her hand in his. "Then let's build it together." A future. A family. The following days brought a sense of peace and warmth to the mansion that had been absent for so long. The cold, sterile atmosphere of the estate seemed to thaw, and the connection between Rachel, Ethan, and Liam grew stronger. Ethan, once distant and businesslike, now spent more time with Rachel and Liam, joining them for family dinners and even helping to plan the nursery for the baby they hoped to have. The mansion, once a place of isolation, began to feel like a home, a place where love and trust could flourish. One weekend, Ethan invited Rachel to join him for a trip to see Liam. She had been missing her son more than she could bear, and the thought of seeing him again filled her with both excitement and nervousness. When they arrived at Mrs. Wilson's house, Rachel was overwhelmed by the sight of Liam running toward her, his arms outstretched. "Mommy!" he cried, throwing himself into her arms. Rachel hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face as she whispered, "I've missed you so much, sweetheart." Ethan watched from a distance, his heart swelling as he saw the bond between mother and son. When Rachel introduced them, Liam looked up at Ethan with curiosity. "Are you Mommy's friend?" he asked innocently. Ethan crouched down to his level and extended his hand, smiling warmly. "I hope so," he said. The day was spent at a nearby park, where Liam laughed and played, and Ethan, to Rachel's surprise, joined in the fun. He chased Liam through the grass, helped him fly a kite, and seemed to genuinely enjoy the time spent with Rachel and her son. For the first time, Rachel saw Ethan not as a distant businessman, but as a man who was capable of love, of connection, and of becoming part of a family. As the day came to an end, and Liam fell asleep in Rachel's arms, Ethan's usual guarded demeanor had softened. He turned to Rachel and said, "Thank you. Liam reminds me of what's truly important in life. He's a reminder that family, love, and connection are the things that matter most." Back at the estate, Rachel found herself feeling a sense of belonging that she had never anticipated. Ethan's involvement in her life and Liam's had grown deeper, and their once formal relationship had evolved into something more genuine. Ethan began to include Rachel in important decisions, not just about the estate, but about their future. They made plans together, discussed their hopes and dreams, and even talked about starting a family of their own. The connection between them had grown stronger, and Rachel felt a sense of hope that she had never known before. One evening, as they sat in the library together, Ethan turned to Rachel with a serious expression. "There's something I need to say," he began, his tone uncharacteristically hesitant. "When we first met, I thought this was just an arrangement. But now, I want to be with you, Rachel. Not because of the contract, but because I love you." Rachel's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she couldn't find the words. She had never expected this, but hearing those words from Ethan filled her with warmth. "I love you too," she whispered, her voice barely above a whisper. The story ends with Rachel, Ethan, and Liam stepping into an uncertain but hopeful future. Together, they had built something real, something based on love, trust, and the promise of a better life. Though the journey had been difficult, it had brought them closer, and they were now ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. For Rachel, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one where love, family, and hope would guide them toward a brighter future.